What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I am Rico Rutia, here with my co-host today, Brian Pfeiffer.
All right, good evening, everyone.
And today we're bringing you some news updates as well as an interview with David Soul, committed activist and revolutionary socialist in Detroit. Brian will give us more of an introduction as to who David is after the news and these beats. Alright, welcome back everyone. On to the news. I have a couple of items myself this week. First and foremost, Elon Musk and Twitter. Apparently there's been mass resignations at Twitter after Elon Musk said that workers needed to become, quote, extremely hardcore, unquote, in order to create Twitter 2.0. First off, who talks like that? Second of all, kudos and solidarity to those workers for resigning. I hope this sets a wave, man, of workers just being like, fuck this shit, man. We're not putting up with this kind of shit anymore. So kudos to them, and I just wanted to share that. The second bit of news on my plate this week is that Starbucks workers went on strike on Thursday. A press release on the Workers United website tells us that this is the biggest coordinated national action taken by union Starbucks stores in the campaign's history, and that despite being the face of the company, Starbucks workers are underpaid, forced to run understaffed stores, and don't have consistent, reliable schedules. Conditions like these are what lead Starbucks workers nationwide to begin their unionization efforts, because at the same time they see the private jets and million-dollar bonuses the company can afford to provide their executives. Now, Starbucks workers are demanding the right to organize a union free of intimidation and fear. They also include a quote that reads, quote, "Whether it's firing one of my coworkers for wearing a suicide awareness pin, how they've closed down a dozen locations in the process of unionizing, or how we're being denied benefits that non-union stores are getting, Starbucks has left behind the very values that drew many of us to the company in the first place. You cannot be pro-LGBTQ, pro-Black Lives Matter, pro-sustainability, and anti-union. This Red Cup Day, we're organizing for a voice on the job and a true seat at the table," said Michelle Eisen, a worker from the Elmwood Avenue location in Buffalo, New York, the first unionized Starbucks store in the U.S. So hats off and solidarity to all Starbucks workers. And it also needs to be called out that whenever a company cuts off the healthcare benefits to striking workers, or any workers really, but really striking workers, because it's an attack on these workers. When a company cuts off the health benefits for striking workers, you're essentially handing out death sentences, because those workers rely on those health benefits for the medication, for whatever treatment they need to keep themselves alive and healthy. So shame on Starbucks and any other company that ever does this. Moving right along, Brian, you have some updates on us from UAW Local 180 and UAW Local 807 and the strike against Case Holland. What's going on over there, Brian?
So we're here tonight. We're excited to report that the United Auto Workers 180 and UAW 807 have teamed up to have a Solidarity Day, December 17th. In Racine, Wisconsin. There will be a solidarity rally at the Union Hall at 3323 Kearney, Kearney Avenue in Racine. And we'll have a solidarity rally, and then we will go to the picket lines for support. This rally was called a couple weeks ago, and since then, support's been popping all across the state of Wisconsin. We're excited about this. And during the course of these last couple weeks, 3 other locals went on strike, UAW Locals. Rick will be talking about that in California, and 2 more in New York City. So as we are talking today, 5 UAW locals are on strike in this country. 2 in the Midwest, 2 in New York City, and 1 on the West Coast in California. And this holds major potential for all of these strikes to help each other, be in solidarity with each other, and some of that's already in motion. This is pretty unique in recent U.S. labor history to have 5 UAW locals on strike at the same time. So we're excited about December 17th. The idea is vehicle caravans will be coming to Racine from all across Wisconsin and the Midwest. We're asking folks, union community organizations that support the workers, to build solidarity caravans from your local, from your federation office, from the community organization office. These workers have been on strike for almost 7 months over wages and healthcare increases as the major issues, and they need support, especially now that they're facing winter. Concrete solidarity is pouring into 180 and 807. We're seeing union donations coming in. Kenosha Education Association yesterday made a donation. The Racine Labor Council, the Greater Western Federation of Labor in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and many more are donating to the strike fund. Solidarity resolutions are being passed. Caravan plans for December 17th are in motion. And this includes a whole variety of things. Social media sharing is happening and more, but these all need to be increased exponentially to win this strike. The company needs to see that the workers have support, but also helping the workers combat demoralization and giving them hope to carry on. One of the great highlights from this past week, which we mentioned on We Rise Fighting Facebook page, was brother Tom Morello, formerly of Rage Against the Machine, and has worked with Bruce Springsteen and Boots Riley and a bunch of other great musicians over the years and artists. He shared the December 17th Solidarity Day flyer on his Twitter feed, which is almost 1 million followers that he has. And he also tagged the UAW and Bernie Sanders. That was a huge boost to the strike. The workers really loved that and appreciated that. And what we're looking for now is we're really asking listeners to share the flyer, share the information on social media, to begin to or add to your caravans to get to Racine on December 17th. And you can also send monetary donations and gift cards to the local at 3323 Kearney Avenue in Racine, 53403. And if you're there in Racine or in Wisconsin and you're close by, you can always drop non-perishable food items. And the workers, of course, are on strike here. It's very cold right now, and it will continue to be cold. So hand and foot warmers and winter gear is very, very important as well. Socks, etc. And We Rise Fighting this week made some monetary donations, as well as we send full color signs to Racine, and they say we support UAW 180 and 807. So if you're an educator or a transit worker, you can always make a banner or a sign that says educator support 180, transit worker support 180, and so on. That's very much appreciated by the workers there. And we ask our listeners to do everything and anything they can moving up to December 17th and every day for our fellow workers on strike there at 180 and 807. We really appreciate it. An injury to one is an injury to all. Solidarity forever.
Right on. Thank you, Brian. On to the railway workers. To update everyone on where things are at, as of today, Sunday, November 20th, 2022, 7 of the 12 unions have voted to ratify the contract, 3 have voted to not ratify, and the remaining 2 unions are set to vote tomorrow, Monday, November 21st. Also, yesterday, November 19th, was one of the earlier dates in which the workers could have gone on strike, and that didn't happen. So from here, from what I understand, there's a few possible outcomes from what I've read in the capitalist media. NPR tells us that the way the rail unions operate is that all 12 unions representing roughly 115,000 freight workers must ratify the new contract to prevent a national shutdown. If one strikes, the others honor the picket line. CNBC gives us 3 possible scenarios. The first is that if one of the 2 unions votes against ratification tomorrow, the cooling off period clock is reset until December 8th, and a strike could begin on December 9th. The second possible outcome, again as far as CNBC, is that if the Brotherhood of Railway Signalmen does not approve its schedule to align with other unions, a strike would start on December 5th. And the third possible outcome and final, if the BLET and the Smart TD unions vote to ratify the tentative deal, the Brotherhood of Maintenance Workers and the Brotherhood of railway signalmen could strike on December 5th. So December 9th and December 5th seem to be the dates that remain for a possible strike. And as I noted, one of those outcomes came from NPR, and I have to note and point out that in that same article, which was written 3 days ago, NPR was also touting that $2 billion figure from the Association of American Railroads, which was discussed on this podcast previously. And I think that's newsworthy in and of itself. The exact quote is that, quote, the strike would be an economic disaster, costing the country as much as $2 billion a day, the railway industry has warned, unquote. Now, I think it's kind of reckless to just reprint numbers like that, especially after reading the report that was written and that I discussed on the previous episode of We Rise Fighting. So I just want this to say that because, a lot of people still carry this idea that NPR is this liberal media source or liberal news institution, and it's really not. In this case, by touting those figures, it's helping promote the fear tactics of the bosses. So, yeah, that's not doing a service to the workers in any way. So also, finally on this, just to fulfill my own curiosity, and because I did a presentation last week on how to research profits for corporations, which, if you're on our Facebook page, you can see that video. Also for this reason, I decided to look at the third quarter profit reports from each of the railway companies. And, this is what things look like. CSX is claiming $1.1 billion for the third quarter of 2022. Norfolk Southern is $1 billion for the third quarter. Canadian National, $4.5 billion in profits. Union Pacific, $1.9 billion in profit. And the only one that didn't claim a profit was BNSF, claiming losses of minus $2.6 billion. But still, this is just in the third quarter for each one of these companies. Yes, they can afford sick days for their 115,000 employees. Sick days for all these workers. I mean, the total figure of that is going to amount to millions of dollars. Not billions, millions of dollars. Can they spare millions of dollars from these billions that they're earning in just one quarter alone? Absolutely. So a railway strike doesn't have to be this big economic mess. Again, I've been saying this repeatedly on this show. This could be resolved very easily. Give them sick days. And finally, as Brian mentioned, lots of stuff happening with the UAW right now. Lots of historic stuff in our perspective. UAW Local 2865, which represents academic workers on the West Coast, is still on strike with 48,000 workers. I went to the website today, and the website has a solidarity message from Bernie Sanders. He says he's standing strong with them and in solidarity with them. The website also had footage from rallies, a solidarity message from the Teamsters Joint Council 7 President Rabinowitz, a solidarity message from the president of AFSCME Local 3299, and a solidarity message from university faculty. So, solidarity message from us. UAW, we are watching you. We are excited with what's happening. We now turn our attention to an interview we did with David Soul, a longtime and committed activist in Detroit. Brian, can you give us a little bit more background on David, please?
All right. Tonight on We Rise Fighting, we're talking to Brother David Soul from Detroit. Brother David is a former executive board member at UAW, United Auto Workers Local 15, the former Fisher Body Fleetwood plant, and co-chair of the Stop Plant Closings Committee of that local. Brother David is also the past president of the UAW Local 2334 from 1995 to 2008, and he's also a co-founder of the Moratorium Now Coalition in Detroit. David is a revolutionary socialist, going back a ways in Detroit and around the country, has traveled internationally talking to workers as well in various different capacities. Brother David, we're honored to have you on the We Rise Fighting Labor podcast today. Would you please, just like usually, start by asking our guests if you could share some of your background. Where do you come from, and how and why did you start being an activist as a student and then becoming an organizer and revolutionary in Detroit. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian and Rick and Jerry. Glad to be with you this evening. I I was born in New York City and came of age in the 60s. And my first experience with protests was the civil rights movement, which was coming into New York City in the about 1964 with a citywide shutdown of all the schools to protest racist, discriminatory funding. And that was in February 1964. I was a senior in high school, and we shut our school down in that activity. A little later, a few more years went by, I was in Queens College, and the Vietnam War was extremely hot and heavy, and I became active against the Vietnam War protest movements, the Queens Anti-Draft Union at Queens College, and shut down the draft week. So I was very active in both civil rights over those years and anti-war protests. It was also a period when the U.S. was invading Dominican Republic, and it was exposed how the sugar interests were behind that U.S. overturn of the government there. There was just a lot going on in the world, and it certainly opened my eyes to linking the issues and seeing that it wasn't just a few problems here in the U.S. It was a worldwide system of capitalism and imperialism that profited the rich and impoverished the poor and working class people, and got me interested in a labor movement.
You were a former executive board member at UAW Local 15 and co-chair of the South.
Yes, I ended up in the Midwest because I went to graduate school 1 year at University of Michigan, 1968 to 1969. And when I left school there, I moved to Detroit with a group of activists who had been in the Students for Democratic Society, which was the radical movement on campuses around the country. And when I moved to Detroit, I soon went into one of the auto plants where I worked for 17 years, the General Motors Fleetwood plant, which closed in 1989. But yes, I was on the I was a rank and file activist in the local for a long time. I led a wildcat strike of 5,000 workers in 1976 for 3 days, and later on became an executive board member of that local. And when the plant closed, I went to work for City of Detroit Water Department and ended up as president of the Chemists Union there, which became UAW Local 2334, and I was president for about 13 or 14 years.
Hey, David. First off, it's great to have you on the show. This is real cool for me, man. So the listeners know I used to live in Detroit, as did Brian. And any activist event I would go to, there was David Soul, man. Whether it was a strike, a rally, a meeting, an anti-war meeting, he was there. So it's really cool to have you on the show. Just want to say that first of all.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah.
And you come to Detroit, you'll still find me at most of the rallies and protests.
That's what's up. That's what's up. Yeah. My question is about what Brian mentioned, the 1995 newspaper strike. Could you give us a general what happened there, some background on the strike, some highlights, and definitely some lessons for today's activists?
Yes, it's very instructive, that strike. It was a strike by six unions that worked at the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, and on all different types of jobs. And they went into the strike thinking it would be just another strike, go picket for a while, negotiate, get a settlement, go back. That's kind of the thinking of a lot of workers. But that strike was really the first use of massive number of strike breakers, we call them scabs, and an attempt to break the unions. And the unions that went on strike were totally unprepared for that eventuality. They didn't know how to respond. The picket lines were attacked, and the unions called for support, and so many of us went up there. We had several thousand people surround the Sterling Heights printing plant near the beginning of the strike, or a few months into the strike, and we actually shut the plant down. They sent in about 200 or 300 police in complete armored riot gear, 4-foot sticks, shields, and it was a very heavy situation. It looked like there was going to be civil war at the time. The unions were threatened with an injunction, and they called off the mass picketing. It was clearly thousands of us who gathered were not just the newspaper strikers. They were from all the big UAW locals and other workers, AFSCME and our union, which was the chemist union, the water department, and we were turning out to shut the plant down. And the union officials actually got frightened by the whole thing. I was at a meeting where they said, but they could have put us in jail. And anyone who had been in the anti-war movement or the civil rights movement laughed. Well, put you in jail, so what? Dr. King was in jail. But they called off the mass picketing at that plant, and we ended up picketing at distribution centers every Saturday night for like 8 or 9 weeks. There were protests outside these places where the newspapers that had been printed got dropped off and sent out. And it was literally hand-to-hand fighting with security guards and scabs and Detroit police. Every Saturday night we would go out, we would gather and go out and stop most of the distribution of those. It was for the Sunday papers, which is their big money maker. Well, at some point they called that off, and the unions basically went into hibernation, you might say. And in the midst of that, and this is important, a rank and file movement arose among the workers themselves, the strikers, and alongside of them there was the Action Committee of Strikers and Supporters, ACOS, which I was part of, and we were help organize picket line support and protests and try to circulate at that point, at the height of the threats against the unions and the police attacks. Some of us put together a proposal calling for the unions to vote. Every Southeast Michigan union, we suggested, should talk to their members and take a vote for a general strike. We didn't call for a general strike. We said each local should discuss it and give their leadership the authority to call a general strike if it was necessary. And I went to the Metro AFL-CIO, Metro Detroit AFL-CIO meeting, and they said, well, you can't do that. You can't have general strikes. And I said, no, you can. And there's a whole history in the U.S. of this. But in any case, we put it out there, and about 6 or 7 locals, including the largest Ford local, did take votes, either of their executive boards or membership, authorizing for a general strike. Of course, that did not proceed, but it showed the possibility in a situation so tense and so sharp, class struggle, that this old tactic of the unions, the general strike, could be resurrected and get a hearing. It wasn't too far out there for people to understand. that strike dragged on because the pullback from the unions of any militant tactics, and was and after a few years, we put forward a proposal, again from the rank and file and supporters, for a national march in Detroit, and the national leadership of the AFL-CIO accepted that idea, and the newspaper unions accepted it, as long as it wasn't anywhere near the striking plant. And there was a huge march in Detroit that came out of the rank and file efforts. So it showed that a strike like that showed the possibilities that radicals and socialists and activists could influence the direction of and make demands and put forward ideas that were acceptable and actually necessary and seen as such by the rank and file workers. The strike dragged on for many years, and in the early 2000s, a number of the workers did get their jobs back, and but it was not a defeat that the newspaper association, the bosses, thought they were going to get. It wasn't a victory that the workers could have gotten if they would have pushed it further at the time.
Gotcha. Interesting. You know, I've been holding on to something that you said early on, in saying that the unions weren't ready, and I heard some answers to that already, but you know, I want to ask both for myself and for our listeners. You know, Detroit is known as a union town, and one idea that we've been bouncing back and forth or asking ourselves is, are some unions still clinging to the idea that if you just go out on strike and hold out long enough, you'll win? So I guess my question is, was the union leadership in that mentality? Was it the product of generations of business unionism? Could you speak to the leadership of the unions at that time a little bit?
Yeah, it's my feeling that, first of all, some people said, oh, they were all sellouts and they were being bought off and that. I never believed that. I knew some of them. I met some of them. I think they were totally unprepared for this situation. Years of, like you said, business unionism had trained them to think, well, we'll just push it a little bit, then we'll go behind closed doors, and we'll get a settlement, and we'll go back with something better. And they didn't realize that a new era was upon them of strike breakers and union busting. There were, and Detroit was, and to some extent is, a union town, although so many plants closed that base is gone to a great extent. But even at the time, we heard that the leadership of the UAW, I'm talking about the top leadership, which was helping with additional funds for the strikers, because everyone knew this was a dangerous situation of strike breaking. And the UAW was supplementing their strike benefits, and we heard this later, that the UAW top leaders were furious at the union officials for pulling back and not being militant. It's my personal belief that at the height of things, when we had surrounded the plant and they had hundreds of cops there, that the union officials should have gone further. They should have called on every union. They should have called on, generated this idea for a general strike. Even the flyer we put out about the general strike said, we don't think a general strike will need to be called. When Wall Street hears that the union after union after union in Metro Detroit area is authorizing a general strike, they will call the newspaper bosses and tell them to stop what they're doing, that it would terrorize them. And some of us were at a meeting where the union officials, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, some of the union officials said, oh, they could have taken our treasuries and put us in jail. And SCLC leader was at the meeting, and they're not that active in Detroit. But they got up and they laughed and they said, what are you talking about? Dr. King threw injunctions in the garbage. He went to jail. What are you afraid of? Any of us who had experience knew that. didn't have to, but they had no experience in this, and they weren't willing to take it to the limit and see who blinked first.
So, David, today we have a strike somewhat similar, but of course different. It's 2022 going on against Case Holland, which the UAW Local 180 is a founding local of the UAW, formed in the 1930s, and their sister local is 807 in Burlington, Iowa. They make agricultural implements and related items. It's a production facility mostly, and they've been out for 6.5 months now. And there's going to be a solidarity rally December 17th. Do you have any thoughts on some tactics or any other thoughts regarding the strike and how those who are in support could help them?
Well, I know you've been working hard on this, Brian, and I applaud you for it. What Rick said about trying to last one day longer, it's not easy for workers to do that. You know, people have mortgages, they've got rent to pay, they've got to feed families. It's extremely difficult. And for a local, even a medium-sized local or small local or large local, they can't face these international corporations alone. And so solidarity days like you've been building for the 17th are important. It beats me why that wasn't brought up, why that's coming from just the local. Why isn't it coming from the international leadership of these unions? They may have taken hits in the last decades, but they are still a powerful force. And, it's really, it's unfortunate. They may give it lip service, but they put a lot of energy and money into supporting Democratic Party candidates. But what about rank and file workers who need it on the ground? Those same organizers and funds could be used, or at least portion of them could be used to build caravans from all through the state of Wisconsin, and for that matter, the Midwest, and to pack the area and show that they won't give up. There were many of these activities. We had an activity here at Pittston in the 1990s. Pittston coal was on strike, and Bob King, who later became UAW International president, was Region 1A director, and he organized a car caravan, which I participated in, down to I forget, Camp Solidarity. They had a tent city we set up with 200 some odd cars and trucks driving down with food and packages and $250,000. And that was just from Detroit down into Virginia. We stayed there several days and showed our support. That could easily be done. The public opinion polls show that this is the most pro-union period among the public, that people are saying they support the idea of unions. And young people are showing it in their organizing at Amazon and Starbucks and all these locations under the most difficult organizing conditions and succeeding in many cases. This, a clarion call from leadership on a national level would really galvanize, would electrify people around the country.
David, this is Jerry. It's great to hear you and to see you. And I want to mention that I've been following your work and have known you for about 40 years or so, but only lately have I begun to work with you more closely. And in review of what you just said about the internationals and why aren't they doing things, I think I want to ask you a question about, how we can put the internationalists back into the internationals. I know you've been very involved in internationalist work and solidarity, back during the Iran war. You were active going to Iraq and making people realize how the sanctions were killing people and how really the sanctions were just another form of the war. And you've also been involved in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and in support of the Palestinian freedom struggle. Why is this still so important today? And, how can we, improve an internationalist outlook in organized labor?
Great question, Jerry. And most important, the working class in the United States is tens, hundreds of millions of workers and our families, but we are not isolated from what's going on in the rest of the world. The people who put the screws to us here, the oil companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the corporate giants, the bankers who profited off the foreclosure crisis in the country, these are the same people doing things overseas. We call it imperialism. It's a fancy word, but it just means that the bosses here are also profiting, maybe even more so, off this labor overseas. In South Africa, it was so evident. The U.S. had, under apartheid, which was overturned around 1990, but before then, the U.S. had 400 U.S. corporations had investments in South Africa, factories. Ford, GM, they all had factories in South Africa making super profits off of virtual slave labor, people who could not unionize and had no political rights. And if they did try to protest, were gunned down. And we have to pay attention to that because the bosses that are oppressing us here are making money overseas and strengthen themselves that way. Our solidarity helped end apartheid. Of course, the people of South Africa really were the ones who did it, but certainly there was a worldwide protest movement, and we can't be diverted. You can't be against your bosses here and support what they're doing overseas. The oil companies that screw us here, even more so today than before, are the same ones that finance Israel against the Palestinian people and use it as a military arm to protect U.S. oil investments and profits in the Middle East. We can go around the world, and this is what we see over and over again. So it's very clear that we have to have a working class movement that is not diverted into supporting their own oppressors, our own bosses, but that supports workers around the world.
But David, in the last 10, 11 years in the Midwest, goes to many of the points you just raised, from Wisconsin in 2011, which was a massive occupation of the state capitol in opposition to the Act 10, which we lost the battle and it did eviscerate collective bargaining rights, but there was a upheaval and an occupation of the state capitol, to Detroit in the fight that you all put up against the bankruptcy there of the banks and stealing retirees' pensions. You've been involved in many of these struggles, the Moratorium Now Coalition in Detroit, and other organizations that you've been in alliance with or in coalition with in this time period. Can you describe some of the experiences that you had and some of the lessons from these struggles that we can use moving forward?
Well, I'm glad you raised the bankruptcy. Detroit declared bankruptcy in 2013, and it was a phony bankruptcy. There were other cities in the U.S. You look at the ones who were their debt ratio to income ratio. Detroit was not the top of the list, but Detroit is a majority black city, African American city, and they knew that if they could target Detroit would have trouble gathering support from the surrounding counties and cities that were majority white, and they just went and did that. Detroit, they knew they couldn't get the elected officials to go along with this, just because the pressure from the people was so great. So they passed a law for emergency management in Detroit. This is after the people put a ballot proposal up, an initiative that outlawed that overturned emergency managers. And then as soon as that vote was over, the lame duck Republican legislature and governor passed an act which allowed them to have emergency managers. And that's basically a dictator. Folks have to understand that was a dictator. And the law said that the emergency manager, the dictator, could void all contracts. The only thing that was sacred and could not be touched, this is in the law, was the debts owed to the banks. So they went and they declared Detroit bankrupt, went to a federal court. Now, why did they go to federal court? Well, it's a bankruptcy court. But why did they do that? Because the state constitution said the pensions of retired public employees cannot be impaired, cannot be cut. And the judge said, I'm a federal judge. I'm not bound by the state constitution. And they went after the pensions. Now, folks, there was plenty of propaganda about this, and this went over a year and a half. And folks, if you talk today, they don't even know what happened. They say, oh, well, they declared bankruptcy. They got out from some of their debt. Well, of about $9 billion that the Detroit debt that was canceled, 85% of that, about $8 billion, came from retired city workers, 30,000 of us, because I had retired the year before. And they took parts of our pension up to 20% immediately, and another 20% over our lifetimes because we lost cost of living. So it's estimated City of Detroit workers lost up to 40% of their pensions to pay, and the bankers didn't pay a penny, nothing. And and then the criminal part was that the union officials went along with this. And I knew one of the guys who was working with the federal judge, and he said, oh, Dave, we're doing the best that we can. I said, no, you're not. You didn't call out the mass of retirees and city workers. You didn't bring us to the brink of civil war. You didn't threaten to shut the whole city down. Any union officer would know, even if you're not sure you can call a strike, threaten to call the strike and see if they blink first. But they went along with this. And it was our Stop the Theft of Our Pensions Committee, which is part of what we call the Moratorium Now Coalition here, which was initiated to fight the foreclosures. That's a whole other struggle. But our Stop Theft of Pensions Committee called together retirees, and we'd have meetings of 20, 30, 40 retirees. In one case, we had 100, 200 workers come to a meeting. We leafleted, and we called the protest, the first protest, I never forget it, against the bankruptcy and against touching our pensions. And I had a hand-lettered sign that said, hands off my pension. And it was all me. I was all in the papers because nobody else was saying this. And later we printed shirts and picket signs and everything else we needed. But it started off with a few of us, and we got that ball rolling. But the first picket line drew about 100 workers at the City Hall in Detroit, the Coleman A. Young Municipal Center. And it was the summer, it would have been 2013, and they had just gone into court. And so we were out there chanting, just getting our committee going, getting names. And I see the top AFSCME, AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Union leaders were coming up. And I think to myself, oh, great, they're going to join us. But they didn't. They stood off to the side and watched. They wanted to see what we had. They didn't want this thing to get out of hand. And they never called protests. we called the protest. At one point, we surrounded the federal building with 2,000 retirees and supporters. Buses came in from New York City and other places. And we had a huge sound system outside where retirees were talking. And inside the courtroom, we had hired one lawyer for $1. And I was the retiree chosen to represent all the rest of us. So on the record, I'm the only retiree individually to protest or to challenge the bankruptcy. So we were in the court with a great lawyer, and we were outside. And later that week, one of the top union officials who was in there with the judges and in some secret meetings going on, he came out and he said to a group of us, he said, you know what they asked? They asked, is this going to be another 1967, referring to the big rebellion in the black community where they had to send the army in. And that's what they were afraid of. And that's what the union didn't understand. The union officers, top guys, didn't understand that it was their duty to bring us to the brink of that civil war and make them blink first. Later on, a year later, when there were some Black Lives Matter protests going and they were seizing, remember how they blocked freeways and things like that? I was in a meeting with a retiree. She must have been 80-something years old. And she said, we should have done what the Black Lives Matter people did, block the freeways. And so even they knew that you had to use extreme tactics for these things. But in the end, we paid, lost our health care completely. They stole a big portion of our annuities and of almost 4% of our, over 4% of our pensions. And also our cost of living, which was about 2.5% a year. So they got fat off of us, and they're still milking this. They think Detroit. They say Detroit's broke, but they still find ways to milk this cow.
Yeah. David. Last week we had David Van Dusen, the president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, on the show, and he was talking about how the Vermont AFL-CIO has embraced the idea of a general strike in the event of another right-wing coup. I was wondering your thoughts on this, what you thought, it would take to pull off any general strikes, just your thoughts on this matter.
Yes, that's very important, and thank you for running those. You did a couple of things with Vermont leaders, and they are truly remarkable and stand out for their militancy. I wrote an article in October, late September, early October, before the election in 2020, when it was clear Trump was already talking about negating the election and threatening just to take power. And I wrote an article you probably could find on fightingwords.net, but where I talked about that the only thing that could really stop him, we couldn't depend on the police. We couldn't depend on the military. Half the officers probably were in his pocket, Trump's pocket, or in the right wing's pocket. Yeah, we can't fight fascism by staying at home. We needed a general strike. That's a tool. But you can't just snap your fingers and have that happen. And I outlined how the AFL-CIO, in their constitution, had the authority to do something like that, even though they tell you they couldn't. But they have language about protecting the general welfare of the population, people, and so on. And the UAW has a specific provision in its constitution for the possibilities of a general strike. So I went over all of this, and that the union locals need to start talking about it. This is 2 months before the November election in 2020, which Trump, of course, lost, but didn't want to lose, and talked about that you can't snap your fingers. Locals now had to start talking to their members about what a general strike is, what the dangers approaching were, and get them to discuss it, and then ultimately authorize the leadership to call a general strike. And And for that matter, I even added a suggestion that many veterans are in the unions, and the veterans ought to form committees, veterans-led committees for defense that could ultimately be armed defense. Well, some people thought that was out there. I tried to raise that I worked part-time, and I tried to raise it in this union local that I had, and people say, well, we can't go on a general strike. Who's going to pay our electric bill? They didn't conceive of what was dangerous, how dangerous this situation was. And I raised this in December, before January 6th, but after the election. So a number of us did some work publicizing that. I won't claim credit, but I know the Rochester, New York, and the Seattle Central Labor Councils all passed really good resolutions, and we helped circulate those around, calling for a general strike if Trump and the military or anybody tried to pull a coup. We also drafted a statement to soldiers and circulated that over the internet, and some people in different parts of the country picked up on it to distribute or get into the hands of soldiers that they should disobey illegal orders. And I think January 6th confirmed what we feared, that there was conspiracy, deep conspiracy. A lot of it hasn't come out about between the Secretary of Defense and some of the generals. And was how did it take so long to send anybody to relieve the Capitol? And how come those cops were so underprepared for what they eventually faced? In any case, that may have been just the first shot in what's going to be a long struggle. I called it in an article after January 6th that was Trump's beer hall putsch, referring to the 1927, I want to say, or 26, uprising led by Hitler, which had similarities to January 6th, 2021. But we shouldn't assume everything's going away, and we still have a responsibility, each of us individually, to make sure that at least some of us are prepared for what's coming. Let me say this also, that while the Democrats claim to be opposed to all of this, you cannot win. I mean, Trump isn't the problem, and Bannon, and those are individuals, but there are tens of millions of really ultra right wingers, fascists for that matter, who are prepared to do anything to push forward their racist, anti-worker agendas, and we have to realize that the only way you can undermine, now some of them can't ever be won over, but you can undermine their mass base only if you have a program that appeals to them, not on racist basis, but on a working class basis of solidarity and healthcare and ending student debt. And there are so many issues that we could raise, that could be raised and fought for and won. And the Democrats don't do that. They raise a few things and they've been unable to carry out. And people say, oh yeah, well, it's Manchin and Sinema. But you know what? If Manchin and Sinema weren't opposing it, others would come forward, because behind all of the senators and Congress people, there's a powerful ruling class of bankers, Wall Street bankers and bosses and their agents who want the Democrats to keep the lid on things, keep people thinking things are going to change, but not ultimately change them. Because to change things in this country would mean to reduce the profits or eliminate the profits of the corporations and funnel them into what people need. And that's the danger. So we can't depend on the Democrats. We shouldn't depend on any cops or the generals. And we better start, if we're serious, we better start talking to our workers, co-workers, and unions, and building networks that can come together a lot faster than we did. Because we should have been out, there should have been able to have a mass response on January 6th to confront these people, and that doesn't exist right now.
One more question from me and then Brian, and then we will go ahead and wrap it up. Question from me is this, there's a lot going on right now as far as labor activism. We're seeing some stuff happening in Amazon, Starbucks, the railway workers, the Teamsters have a new leadership. Just yesterday, 48,000 UAW graduate students went on strike in California. So a lot of stuff to be excited about right now. What advice do you have to younger or newer labor activists that are just getting involved right now these days?
If you see a picket line, get out of your car and get on it. That's my advice to young workers. And they know how to organize better than we do. They got the telephones. I was down in West Virginia for a teacher's strike. It would have been around 2018. A group of us from Detroit drove down there to show support. And these teachers did this all on their own with cell phones. They coordinated picket lines and they shut the whole state down, something you'd think would be very difficult, but they made it easy. But also keep in mind that while we're fighting for labor rights, we need to be extremely conscious. The bosses have tools that they bring out every time there's any kind of uprising or surge, and they bring out racism, and they bring out anti-immigrant, and they bring out anti-women sentiment, and they beat the drum for anti-LGBTQ ideology, anything to keep people divided. And this is nothing new. If you go back to the old days in the 1890s or some of those strikes, you'd see that they had consciously put 10 different nationalities, all speaking of immigrants from, say, Europe or other countries, in the same factory, so they couldn't speak together, talk together, and organize. But we can overcome these divisions, but they got to be consciously overcome. We have to fight against any semblance of racism or sexism or anti-gay bigotry. We've got to fight that. That'll build a united front which can defeat the bosses. After all, the youth weren't wrong. They were close to accurate when they said we are the 99%, but in reality, we are the 99.99%. The ruling class is tiny, and even with their hangers-on, they are not that powerful. They seem to be powerful because we're not always organized, but we saw how weak they were in the protests around George Floyd. That scared the hell out of the leaders of this country. I'm not talking the political leaders. I'm talking about the boardrooms and bankers who saw that, and what they feared even more than just that it was everywhere in the country. There was solidarity between white youth and black youth and Latinx and Palestinian youth and Native youth were all out. And some of us who weren't so young also were there.
All right, David. Well, we thank you once again. Just one last question for this podcast episode. What is in your view, what is the role of socialists within labor today?
Socialists and communists should be at the forefront of any struggle. If you understand that we're living in a class society of working class and oppressive ruling class, then you need to be in the front of every struggle. And that doesn't mean only communists and socialists will be there, but we need to be there. In addition, we need to think of initiatives and not wait for somebody else to call something, but think of concrete things that could be done. And very particularly what can be done with the forces at hand, or what steps can be taken. It's easy to wave a red flag and say, well, on to the revolution, call a general strike. It's another thing to take these ideas in a way that can be understood by workers where they're at now and take them further and further. So when GM announced 12 plant closings in the late 1980s, we put forward a proposal that a job is a property right. This actually had been said by the Secretary of Labor during the sit-down strikes. And this idea was picked up by Jesse Jackson in one of his the 88 presidential campaign, where I actually met with him and some other workers. We met with him because he was espousing Buy American. And we said, no, that's a chauvinist ideology. That's not going to win workers. What you need to say is that you have your sweat and labor in these factories decade after decade. You built the factories, you build the cars, you build the trucks, you build everything. That gives you sweat equity, and in that, and you have a property right in this, and you should not be able to be laid off. And he took that out in his election campaign around the country, and especially in Michigan, and got a great response to that. Now, that's not saying we're going to promote Jesse Jackson, but it's saying that these ideas can catch on. And the same with the need for a general strike. We need to put that forward, not in an artificial or ultra-left way. We need to, with the bankruptcy in Detroit, we put forward the very simple slogan, hands off our pensions, make the banks pay. And we took on directly the Wall Street bankers in that bankruptcy. And now they claim they could have taken all our pensions, and I like to think that they only took a part of it because of the militant struggle that we put up. And that was from the grassroots. Let me just tell you one thing. You ever heard during the bankruptcy, they wanted us to vote to support they called it the grand bargain. We called it the grand theft bargain. So that we would vote for our own oppression, and we couldn't sue them then. And so we were campaigning against that. And the judge, that was not the judge in charge of the bankruptcy, but his guy who was working with him, his name was Judge Rosen, called every preacher in Detroit and asked them to preach a sermon to the workers and their families that the retirees should support the bankruptcy grand bargain. And I've never heard anything like that. A federal judge telling preachers to campaign for a lousy deal for the workers. But that's the kind of things they did. So, I wonder if the union leaders had more guts at the time, instead of just watching us and trying to figure out how they could stay out of the struggle, and if more of the preachers had gotten with us and more of the community leaders, we could have stopped that bankruptcy and made the banks pay, because they didn't pay a cent. Anyway, so socialists and communists should be thinking of concrete proposals, how to get their ideas popularized, but still very militant into the hands of the workers and develop struggles.
Well, right on. Thank you so much, David. It's been a pleasure hearing, about your experience, your life. Definitely very insightful. And, you and I have never delved this deep in our many encounters. So certainly a big pleasure for me. So thank you, David, and thank you to all our listeners. Tune in again next week for labor news and more from We Rise Fighting Labor podcast.
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. 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 De pie cantar que vamos a triunfar. Avanzan ya banderas de unidad y tú vendrás marchando junto a mí y así verás tu canto y tu bandera florecer, la luz de un rojo amanecer anuncia ya la vida que vendrá. De pie marchar, el pueblo va a triunfar, será mejor. Y ahora el pueblo que se alza en la lucha con voz de gigante gritando adelante. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. La patria está forjando la unidad. De norte a sur se movilizará. Desde el salar ardiente y mineral al bosque austral, unidos en la lucha y el trabajo irán, la patria cubrirán, su paso ya anuncia el porvenir, de pie cantar, el pueblo va a triunfar, millones ya imponen la verdad, de acero son, ardiente batallón, sus manos van llevando la justicia y la razón, mujer, con fuego y con valor, ya estás aquí junto al trabajador, y ahora el pueblo